Today's LED project is a hex tile light. For this project, I was inspired by the many popular hexagon-shaped lights online and decided to take a unique approach to making my own DIY version. This light is made using standard porcelain tiles covered in clear epoxy. Since there are tons of different styles and shapes of tile, there are many other possible unique designs which can be made in this way. So let's begin. To start, I went to Lowe's and picked out 2 pieces of this white hex tile to use. I decided to cut the tile in half in order to make the light longer and so it would fit in the area where I wanted it installed. The other main material I needed was a 2-part epoxy resin which I got off Amazon. This would be what holds the tile together in the frame while also allowing light to pass through the gaps. And finally, the last main item for this project would be the LED lights and controller. With the main items gathered, I was ready to start with the build by first preparing the mold to pour the epoxy in. I used some MDF board to make the mold and cut it to size according to the tile measurements. Once I had the mold frame complete, I covered it with packing tape, making sure to seal all the edges to prevent spilling. This would also make it easier to remove from the epoxy once it was dry. I cleaned the tiles off just before putting them into the mold. At this point, I was ready to mix and begin the epoxy pour. This was my first time working with epoxy, so I was unsure exactly what to expect or how much to prepare for the pour. I simply filled up a plastic cup to the top with half part A and half part B. Unfortunately, as soon as I started mixing, the camera ran out of storage, and just seconds after that, the battery also died. I had a misconception of how much working time I had available. While I was trying to fix the camera setup, the epoxy had started hardening, and by the time I got back to pouring it, it was too late. I should have stopped myself sooner, but I ended up ruining half the tile light since the epoxy wouldn't flow into the mold anymore. I decided to keep going, however, and try again on the other side. The best I could do at this point to save the project was to cut the light in half. The second attempt at pouring went much smoother. I was able to get a clean result on the other side. So I let that sit for 24 hours to cure. The next day, I came back to remove the mold. It came off very easy after removing the screws, thanks to that clear packing tape. The MDF board even remained in good enough condition to be reused. I did a brief test now with the LEDs to make sure I was on the right track for the final look. I had already planned to put the LEDs directly behind it, but I wanted to get a quick look at what would happen if I set the LEDs directly beneath or in the front. I was ready now to cut the bad half off. To make the cut, I used a tile cutting machine with a diamond saw blade. Since it was a quick cut, I chose not to set up the water jet and just used a spray bottle with water instead. I decided to modify the shape at this point by cutting the corners to make the overall shape like a stretched hexagon rather than a simple rectangle. This would make building the frame harder, but I felt it would be worth the effort in the end. To make the frame, I first took measurements of each side. Since I am reusing a piece of scrap wood, I needed to cut the wood into strips of about 1 1/4 inch thick. Then, I needed to cut a groove into each of the strips, which would be where the epoxy tiles fit into. Since I don't have a benchtop router table, I had to use my table saw and run the wood through multiple times to create the groove. The edges of the epoxy tiles had some imperfections, so I used a belt sander to smooth it out and make it easier to fit into the grooves. After all the pieces were ready, I painted them with a light blue paint. Now, I was ready to put the frame together. I put some wood glue between the pieces, as well as some wood filler on the front face to fill the gaps between the pieces. The wood glue alone was not enough to hold the frame securely together, since it was being applied on top of the paint. So I decided to add some small pieces to the back in order to strengthen the frame. These little pieces would also give the benefit of raising the build from the wall slightly to allow light to spread around the outside of the frame. Finally, I prepared a back panel using a thin plywood cut to the shape of the light. I used a glossy white paint for the side that would be on the inside in order to reflect more light. Installing the LEDs was the easiest part of the build. I quickly wrapped a strip of WS2812B LEDs around the inside frame, soldered an ESP8266 microcontroller with a WLED firmware installed, and connected a 5V power supply to the back. After screwing in the back panel, the final steps to complete this build was to do a few paint touch-ups around the frame and screw in a hook for mounting it on the wall. The final results look great, and I'm really happy to add this with my collection of other WLED creations. Now here's some final footage of the finished build. If you liked this video, be sure to check out some of my other WLED creation videos as well. Thanks for watching.